This is my second video in my Treaty of Waitangi series. In the last video, I discussed the parties to the Treaty of Waitangi. On the one hand, we have the British Crown, and on the other hand, I argued that the wording of the treaty is quite clear, that it is the native indigenous tribes of New Zealand. That word native is very important. It's very important not to confuse native with Maori. Maori is an ethnicity. The rights of people are derived from their nativity, not from their ethnicity. So it's important to keep that in mind. And in this second video, I'm going to discuss sovereignty. Now, the basic test for sovereignty, or the basic formula, if you want, for sovereignty is effective rule over a defined territory and the population within that territory. So that can mean a lot of things. An example we can give is a country like Great Britain, which is one of the parties to the treaty, and the sovereignty that they hold over the British mainland by comparison to, say, the North Sentinelese Islanders and the nature and degree of sovereignty that they hold over their tiny little island. So although there's sovereignty that exists in both those situations, it's a matter of fact and degree. And one of the ways of being able to measure sovereignty, because sovereignty is literally that rule of effective government over a defined territory and its population. So it literally comes out to the right and the recognition to rule. So the right to rule, the recognition to rule, is the substance of sovereignty. And of course, the right to rule and the recognition to rule results in what? Rules. So the degree and nature of sovereignty held in a territory over a population by what is said to be the sovereign ruler is reflected in the rules and the rights of the people within that territory. A really good example of that is, say, the freedom of speech. So if we have the right to freedom of speech and we're in territory that doesn't belong to anybody, it has no sovereign ruler, has no rule of law cast upon that territory, then our freedom of speech can't really be a right in the sense that we have a right to speak, because it requires two things. First of all, it requires some sort of rule to prevent other people from stopping us from speaking. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if someone does stop us from speaking, it's actionable. We can do something about it. Without a sovereign, those two situations can't exist. So the freedom to speak is just speaking. There's no freedom in it. Freedom isn't engaged. So that's a good way of kind of looking at sovereignty and saying, well, what sort of sovereignty does this alleged ruler have? To what degree and extent does it extend? Another good example, or a good way to illustrate the difference, is that in the 1840s, the British had, for hundreds of years beforehand, had import controls, customs and excise taxes and things like that on ships coming in and out of its port. They knew who was coming and going like that. There were import duties on certain goods. There were restrictions on things that could come in and so on. Now, that situation meant that they had control over their borders. Interestingly, less than 15 years after the treaty was signed, in 1855, I think it was, just before 1855, the British mainland extended their border control to issuing passports to everybody. Passports before that weren't a thing. So you can see that the British, prior to issuing passports, had a certain degree and quality of control over their borders, and then after they issued passports, they had a greater degree and quality of control. If we look at New Zealand in 1840, there was no control over the borders whatsoever. So there were immigrants coming from all over the country. There were completely uncontrolled importation of lots of muskets and ordnance, which was fueling the Maori Wars, the Musket Wars. So New Zealand, and so whoever the sovereign was, if we consider that the sovereigns, the natives were sovereign prior to 1840, the quality of their sovereignty could not be said to have control over the borders. And this reflects on a fairly recent issue, an argument about sovereignty that I can recall maybe 20 years ago. there was a local group of Maori, I think they were from Gisborne or up north somewhere, and they were issuing their own Maori passports. Now, the problem with that is, as I see it anyway, is that when you cede sovereignty, you can't cede sovereignty that you don't have. And so what is the rule of law? What is the legal structures or the government and organisational structures that you are ceding? Passports wasn't one of them. So when passports become a thing, in other words, they materialise or crystallise over time, when they do crystallise or materialise, the sovereignty over those things belongs to the new sovereign, who has taken cession of all rights, which the treaty does say that, sovereignty, if any. So you can't say that Māori now have some right of sovereignty over controlling the New Zealand borders to the extent of passports, or even to the extent of import and export duties, because none of that they had sovereignty over in the first place, and you can't cede what you don't have. So there's some interesting kind of ways of measuring it, but I think that the best way is to look at what rights and privileges and to what degree and scope were there laws and regulations controlling the native territory and the natives on it by the alleged sovereign. Then you can measure, at least to some degree, what is being ceded. My way of looking at it is that if something arises that you can be sovereign over after sovereignty is ceded, that new sovereignty degree vests with the new sovereign, not the old one. And for that reason, I think things like the airwaves stuff that went on, giving certain preferentials to the indigenous population for radio airwaves and offshore fisheries, I don't think that they were a reflection of what the treaty was intended to do, and certainly not what the British meant to happen. Another example is things like mineral rights. So the government of New Zealand has probably quite rightly given, I think it was Ngāi Tahu down south, rights over greenstone, because that is one of the cultural and customary taonga. But there are no such rights vested in gold and silver, or minerals or coal and things like that. And the reason for that can only be because the indigenous population did not have sovereignty over those things. They didn't use them. They weren't a thing. So you can't say that you can make rules regulating something that you know nothing of. So in 1840, the chiefs of the tribes, united or not, in New Zealand, did not have legislation setting out quotas for offshore fishing or for radio wave licenses. So to that extent, I believe that those settlements, or whatever they were, are completely misconceived. The rights that are presided over, that are held in the sovereignty of Indigenous natives, in the treaty, on my understanding, or the British reading of it, is that all of those rights were ceded except for the rights reserved for the native Indigenous population by the Crown. So what you have is a situation where the Indigenous natives are given British citizenship, conferring on them all the rights of a British citizen, all the rights and privileges. In doing that and passing over that sovereignty, there is going to be an overlap in what rights and privileges the new sovereign is giving you and what you had already. Those rights and privileges don't continue under your old sovereignty, they continue under your new sovereignty. So the old rights and privileges that you had, to the extent that they overlap with your new rights and privileges, are extinguished. The residue of those is where you start getting into what the Crown's going to say you can keep on doing. You can keep on having this right or privilege or exercising this traditional practice or cultural practice, which is beyond this, because the other thing that the British Crown cannot do is it cannot create extra native rights on behalf of the natives. That would be, it's for the natives to create their own sovereignty. The British Crown cannot create it for them. They can't create the substance and degree of it. The British Crown was concerned with creating the substance and degree of its own sovereignty, not someone else's. So you can't get anything extra out of it. You have to look at what was there in 1840, remove what the British were already going to concede anyway, or not concede, but that was the common union between Britain and the native tribes, what they would have had in common prior to the signing of the treaty. The residue or the difference between the two is where we start to get into native rights. And I'll be looking at more detail on what those native rights may be on the formula that I've set out in this video. I'll be doing it in the next video, and I hope to catch up with you then. Thanks for watching.